All right. I haven't got my sound going, but I don't need it that bad. So, did you want to say anything to start off? Or?
Do you want me to? Oh, well, I should. So welcome. We'll get started. Very happy to see you all here. Many back, and glad to see new ones. And this is Dr. Rania Olsen. And she'll make a presentation a little different this week. I think every week will be interesting and new, which I like. And she brought, she's going to do groups where we can talk in smaller groups, which is always better if you're going to talk. So she brought a co-facilitator. This is Dr. Albert Hernandez.
Ooh. The Dr. Albert.
Yeah, indeed. So we are very glad to have him here. And we'll turn it over to Rania.
Yeah, so we'll do that in the second half, and we're going to split up into men and women's, and we'll have a little 5-minute break in there, and then maybe when you come in, we'll sit on different sides or whatever. So let me start off by sort of going over the outline of what we're going to do again. Last week, we did Genesis 1, and for me, this is the one where you have the hard physics, right? And the things that are really important to me there is to kind of talk about what the Bible means to me. And one of the important things is that the Bible's mysterious, and the Bible has unanswered questions, and science helps us find new things in the Bible because it answers some of those questions, but it doesn't answer them all, right? Then in weeks 2 and 3, I'm going to be talking about the creation story that's in Genesis 2 through 3, which is the one that most people think of, in the Garden of Eden with the fruit and everything. And then in weeks 4 and 5, I'm going to be talking about what I call the creation of the nations, which is like the chunk of Genesis that comes after, where we see people split into different ethnic groups and have different languages and relationships between those groups and stuff like that. So I'll say that like last week, I was getting into the hard physics, and I'm not going to do that too much anymore. I'm going to review some stuff from last week, but then we're going to kind of move on into the more human sciences. But I'll just the hard sciences are maybe more difficult to understand, but as we get into more human sciences, they're maybe a little easier to grasp, but also can be a little more emotional and relevant and stuff like that. So that's why now I'm starting to incorporate some group discussion time and stuff like that. So, so to go over the week 1 summary stuff, today we have a lot of different types of books, and our different types of books have different purposes. But the Bible isn't like that. It's not any one particular book. It's a whole bunch of stuff all mixed in together, along with all the spiritual and mysterious stuff. So we can't read it in an easy way. In my opinion, a verse can have multiple correct interpretations, and this is also the way that the Jews have traditionally read the Bible. So especially when it comes to the Hebrew Bible, if we as Christians read it that way, we are giving honor to the original meaning of the text. And I also think that the Bible's not a tool to give us all the right answers, so now we know and we don't have to read the Bible anymore. One of its main purposes for me is to invite us into deeper contemplation with God. And that's why God has left mysteries in the Bible, because if it were easy to read, then it wouldn't be a tool for contemplation. Now, I also talked last week that what at the boundary of physics, which is kind of the hardest, most basic science, there's many unanswered questions, okay? So a lot of people think, who don't do science but know some about it, they think, oh, well, science has pretty much had this all sewed up here, we basically understand everything. But for working scientists, that is not our experience of the world. We feel majesty and awe at the world all the time. And actually, out of the sciences, physics is the one where physicists are the most likely to be religious. Psychology is actually the one where people are least likely to be religious. So there's not a lot of contradiction for me, both in the way that you see the world and then like what you spend time doing, which is contemplating the unknown. Now, I also talked about quantum mechanics, and I'm going to just review a couple points of that now. But, you know, like the big philosophical point I wanted to make is that quantum randomness permits free will. Now, it doesn't say that there definitely is free will, but, you know, a century ago when quantum mechanics was being developed for the first time, the physicists before that were really finding philosophical implications in you know, the fact that they had figured out so many things, and people were asking themselves, does this mean that like the universe is like clockwork, and you know, if we know everything that is now, we can say exactly what will happen next, and does this determinism, you know, remove free will or choice from the equation? And quantumness showed that randomness and unpredictability is imbued in the very basic of creation of the world. And for me, that has deep philosophical implications. Now, it hasn't proved anything, but I kind of think that's the way it's supposed to be. How are we going to prove that there's free will if what free will means is we are uncertain of things? Like, we don't know what will happen next. It's sort of, you know, a little snake eats tail there. It's like circular logic. It's hard to prove there's free will. Now, science did recently solve an ancient mystery about the interpretation of Genesis 1, and that's that Genesis 1 has always been seen by theologians for like the past, you know, 19 centuries as being incompatible with what philosophers thought about the world. Philosophers thought that the world was basically unchanging and static, and you know, what it was 1,000 years ago was what it was 100,000 years ago, and so on and so forth. Whereas the Bible seems to describe creation out of nothing, or creation from some, you know, beginning point. And then in the early 1900s, the Big Bang Theory was first invented, and then in the 1960s, they got enough evidence to convince most scientists that it was true. So that's only 60 years ago that we learned, that science learned, that the universe that we see seems to have a beginning. In my opinion, Christians should have celebrated that more, but evolution has like stolen all of the lifeblood out of that argument, and everything's all about evolution, and we just like didn't notice that actually one of the great scientific mysteries that people had recognized was in the Bible the whole time was solved by modern science. And so for me, that calls me to look for other truths within the creation story, because we've found one truth in there. So I said I was going to go over a little bit of quantum stuff, both because I want to talk a little bit more about the philosophical implications, and because I understand that it's weird and hard to understand. And as I said last week, that's not because you're not getting it. It just really is weird and not intuitive and hard to understand. So what I had talked about last week is that, you know, we've all, like classical imaginations, that there's these things like particles, like I think most people have heard of the atom and electrons and protons. And, you know, they're point particles and they're in one place and not another place. And then there's this other thing called waves. And like we see that in water waves, we can like see them with our eyes, but light is also a wave. And so classical physics always thought there were these two different things. But it turns out you can do this experiment, and if you do an experiment like this with light, you'll see this interference pattern on a screen that you put behind the light. You have to make the slits narrower, like electron-sized instead of light-sized, but you can get the exact same effect with electrons, even though like this pattern is still built up single electron by single electron. It's not like a bunch of them go through at the same time. You can send one electron through these two slits, and somehow it is as if it went through both slits, and you get a wave pattern, even though we're talking about particles. So quantum mechanics has many things like this, where things that we thought were clearly, reasonably, obviously distinct at the macroscopic level, that when we look at the very fabric of the universe, like the smallest size of things that we have, that things that seem very clear and intuitive to us at the human level, like those concepts don't apply anymore. And so that implies that it's, you know, maybe we shouldn't trust our reason quite so much. And I would say that like, the sort of modern age that brought in the age of scientific reason also happened at the same time as the Protestant Reformation. And like a lot of theologians argue over things, they're like, well, clearly, if God made the world, he must have known what we would have done ahead of time, right? So therefore, predestination, right? Those things aren't necessarily, like that technique of just saying, oh, well, this is reasonable and should be reasonable to my human mind, and God must make sense or whatever, not necessarily going to get us to the correct answer. That doesn't, like, I still love reason. I wouldn't be a scientist if I didn't. And you can still apply reason to quantum mechanics, but we have to continually check ourselves and make sure that we're not like leading ourselves down a rabbit hole. And so I think we need to do the same thing for theology. So last week I talked about some,
I think you're having trouble seeing the screen from here.
oh yeah, I just moved this. Last week I talked about some different interpretations of quantum mechanics. And like what that means is there's a math that we know works, but like what does each mathematical thing correspond to in real life? That's the interpretation part. And so there's a lot of different ways we can cast it. Like we can say stuff goes back and forth in time, or we can say that stuff goes somehow over every path at the same time. Physicists who care about this usually have a preferred interpretation, and I'm going to show you some videos about my preferred interpretation, which is that rather than having this funny thing that's sometimes like a particle and sometimes like a wave, that they're two separate things, a particle and a wave, and both of them exist, but we only ever interact with the particle. We can't see the wave. And one of the ways that they have developed this idea is by finding a sort of like big macroscopic analog that behaves in similar ways and that we can like see and understand with our human intuition. And this has kind of helped people understand quantum mechanics. So I'm going to show some videos of this. And my sound is not working, so I'm going to have to try and narrate what this guy says. Sorry, hold on.
They're still having trouble seeing because you're in the line of sight.
Okay. Okay, so what this guy here has is that like this is just a fluid bath and he's putting silicone oil in there. And then he's got his phone hooked up to it here. And then what the phone is doing is it's playing sound. So what the sound is like at a low enough frequency that it's shaking the oil in the bath up and down. And then and you can see it on the zoomed in here, he's like, putting a little pinprick in there and pulling out some droplets. And because the bath is shaking and like air resistance and stuff like that, they stay as droplets and they sit there and bounce on the surface. I don't know why that stopped playing, but yeah, so like let's just look at that one more time while he's gonna turn on the light and then make some droplets on the top. Yeah, so if the fluid wasn't shaking, then the droplets would just fall back into the fluid, but because the bath is shaking, each time it hits, it goes back up and air remains between the droplet and the bath, so it doesn't just go back into the bath. So the comparison here is that the droplets on the surface of the bath are the particles, and then there's vibrations in the bath, and these are the wave. So let me go to the next slide and we'll, yeah, he's gonna say a little bit more stuff which doesn't work because the sound's not working, but and I think I did the wrong one. Let's just look at this one. Yeah, so these are some videos that have been made of some of these experiments. And what they're doing here is like they've taken away the bounce by just taking a picture every time it's at the top. So we don't see the bouncing anymore. But what's happening is like, the droplet goes down and it bounces and it hits the water and it sends out a wave. and then it goes up, and then the next time it comes down and bounces, it hits that same wave, it interacts with the wave from the last time it bounces, and then that wave is going to push the particle off in some particular direction depending on exactly how it hits it. And it's this interaction between the wave of the particle from the last time it hit and the place where the particle is now that determines what happens. And so you get these effects, like you can see on this one, like the particle is the dot in the middle there, and then it has this wave that goes out among it, and you can kind of see a couple different wavelengths. It's like if you threw a rock in the pond, you'd have a few wavelets out around it, except it like keeps hitting over and over again. So the whole time it goes along, it has this thing. And so when it comes up on this slit that is close to the size of its wavelength, like if the slit was huge, it wouldn't care. But because the wave is similar to the size of the slit, there's a complex interaction between the particle's wave and the slit. And then when the particle bounces back down and hits it, it changes its motion. And so what you see is there's this kind of like, this one is one where it goes through the slit and then is fairly straight. And then this one was where it goes through the slit and then sort of turns off to the side. And so because there's this interaction between the particle and the wave, you get, rather than it just going straight, there's chaotic motion. And last week I talked about how we see the same thing when we like just send light through a small slit, is that we see it spread out. And you know, you guys can see this yourselves even, like when you see a little light shining through the clouds and it spreads out, that's diffraction. And that's the same thing that is happening here for this particle, but it's a particle that's guided by a wave. And then this one here is showing two particles where their waves are interacting with each other so that they get into this coherent motion with one another. It's like, you know, they do a little dance with each other. And so, like, this is my preferred interpretation because it makes sense. I like to believe that the world is made of real things. But what we find then about the world is that, you know, like there's this stuff called matter that we like see and interact with. And then there's something called a wave that we don't see. We can't interact it. We can never measure anything about the wave except by observing how the particle behaves. So we didn't discover waves and the effect they have on particles until we were able to like look at things on the scale of atoms, because that's the scale where these things matter. Like here, when you see these guys rotating around here, the distance they are apart is about one wavelength. So when we get down to atoms, we're on the scale where we can see the effects of the wave, even though we don't see the wave itself. And like what this means to me philosophically is like, I kind of think that the wave is also what consciousness is made out of. So like the wave has information about the particle from the past stored in it. The wave is some sort of real thing that exists that can hold information for some time period. And for me, I see that as consciousness. And what that says then is that consciousness is a thing that we can't interact with directly. We only see its effects by the effect that it has on matter. And this is something that we see very much at the human scale, because like me is my body and you is your body, like your body all moves together under your will. It's not like some of your atoms go off this way and others go the other way. It's this coherent structure, kind of like these two particles here, that's held together by a wave of information. And whatever it is that's you, your soul, your consciousness or whatever, all can interact with that information that's in space somehow. And like that's what a soul is. That's what consciousness is. And like one of the things that's really interesting about this is like, you know, like philosophers still talk of this about like the problem of consciousness, like just what is consciousness? And we haven't been able to measure consciousness scientifically. And we don't have a like scientific theory for it. But like a lot of neurologists think, oh, we're just gonna like build a model of the brain, and when we get our model good enough, like consciousness will just pop out. And you know, that's like a view of the world that sees the world as only matter, and then like the sort of complicated things we see at our human scale just like emerge from individual bits acting together. But if you sort of believe that like consciousness or information is an inherent part of nature, and every single piece of matter has some information that goes with it, that's a different view of consciousness as being like some fundamental part of the universe that's always there. And what's special about us compared to this chair or a plant or whatever is not that we have consciousness and it doesn't, it's that our consciousness is like coherent and controlled. So here we don't have to, if this is the way the world works, consciousness isn't something that just emerges at some point like magic. It was always there to begin with. So as I said, we're going to talk mostly about the human sciences from now on. So this is a plot that shows how big the human brain has been, the human brain and our ancestors for the past 6 million years. Yeah, and like our brain size is basically what makes us human. And I went and did some reading about the current research of like, our abilities versus animals' abilities. So, one of the things that we have that animals don't have is language. And you guys probably have heard before of these experiments where you like teach sign language to a chimpanzee or whatever. So, there's creatures who can do language, but they haven't like developed their own language, right? And their brains are smaller than ours. Another thing that's really different between us and animals is like our ability to hold memory for a long period of time. And here again, they found a few animals that have long memories, but most of them don't. Like your dog can remember you as a person for about a month, but it's only remembering a few specific things about you, like your smell and that it likes you and things like that. It's not like it tells stories about you to itself because it doesn't have a good enough memory to do that. A lot of what makes us us, and like what is an integral part of our consciousness, is that we don't just go through the world just experiencing stuff. We also build a story in our head that goes along with that experience, and it's that story that we store in our memory, and that's like a huge part of what makes us us, and animals don't have that. And one of the very big reasons why is we just have more brain that can do that. An animal's brain is smaller compared to its body, and so most of its brain is taken up with like all the automatic stuff you need to do, breathing and heart beating and stuff like that. And then, they do exist in the world and they respond to things immediately, but they don't have a good enough memory or good enough language to be able to store those things as like a story. And so they just don't. So much of how we see the world is not just our senses, it's our senses filtered through our interpretation. So like if you remember this tomorrow, it's not like, some people do have this type of memory, but very few of them. It's not like you close your eyes and you'll see me in front of you talking and you just remember the whole hour and a half experience. You will make a story of that, and that story is what will be stored in your head, along with some sensory information. But most of what you store is memories. And that's, one of the things that makes us human. And, like this process, takes 6,000 years. And like early in this, you see, like our closest ancestors or primates with brains kind of similar to the size that primates have today. And, when we see primates today, like there's some stuff we definitely don't get, but there's a lot of stuff that's very similar to us, like they interact with each other and they groom each other and they care for their children and stuff like that. But, our abilities changed a huge amount because our brains got 3 times bigger than primates. Now, like you can't really see it on this scale, but it's sort of like about here where we become anatomically modern humans, to the degree where, like, if you go back and look at a fossil of a human from 300,000 years ago, it looks close enough to us that we call it the same species. However, of course, like during this last 300,000 years, our brain has still been growing, and we've still been acquiring new skills. And it's over this last 300,000 years where we developed language. Like, we didn't have language 300,000 years ago. And along with that came art and burial rituals. And all of those things that we now consider culture, they developed along with our ability to describe the world to each other and to like create what they call episodic memory, a memory that's like, this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. And that is what has made us humans. And like, one of the fascinating things about the evolution of humanity is that nobody took this leap that we did. Like, it's not like, I mean, you know, chimpanzees have some similarities to us, but still their brain's 3 times smaller than ours compared to the size of their body. So no other creature took this huge leap that we did. Now, if I ask an anthropologist or biologist to give me a scientific explanation and I say, you know, like, let's leave God out of it, you know, they're going to say that one of the things that was real important to us developing language and culture is the fact that we lived in groups. So like, you know, if we were like hamsters and we lived by ourselves, we wouldn't need to develop language because we use language to communicate things to each other. And you know, if we look at animals that do just have the tiniest ability to communicate with each other, most of what they're communicating to each other is like, I found some food over here, let's go forage over there today. And you know, like, if you see primates out in the forest, they will go through this very social process to decide which way to go today. And like, you know, some different guys will be like, and then they'll be like, are you guys following me? You know, and then if they're not, they'll like go back. And it's this, like, you sit there and watch them for a couple of hours. It takes the whole band a couple of hours to decide which way to go. And it's this very social, democratic process where some different brave people try some stuff and then they see who will go along with them, right? And you know, like, today our culture is very individualistic. And so, like, we have the ability to live as individuals if we want to, you know? Like, we don't have to live with anybody else. We don't have to depend on anyone else, you know, once we're past childhood and probably before we're, you know, old enough to need care again. And so the fact that social behavior is what made us who we are is kind of masked today. But like, having social behavior allows us to do so much more. It's not, if you have a tribe, it's not like the tribe is like, well, okay, on Wednesday we're gonna pick apples, and on Thursday we're gonna hunt boars, and on Friday we're gonna sew clothes. Different people do different things, and that means that the tribe is more than the sum of its parts. And to do that, they have to communicate. They have to be able to communicate about what they're gonna do, and they also need to communicate for like relationship building and all of that kind of stuff too. And so if you ask, you know, the scientist crowd who works in these kinds of related fields, biology and anthropology, they'll say it's our social behavior that made us human. Now, religiously speaking, like when evolution was first proposed, like even before Darwin's theory, when they were starting to find fossils in the record, there were Christians that had no problem saying, like, maybe God used evolution, right? You know, it's sort of like it's more masterful to set up something that continues to make different things than just making one copy of each thing and then making them copy. Like, it's more kind of amazing and masterful to build a universe that like gets more and more complex over time. Because there are many Christians early on who saw the glory and majesty in it the same way that I do today. And it was sort of like these historical accidents that turned it into this big political battle. And as I mentioned to you last week, this is really only a big political battle among white Americans, okay? Like, most other countries are not having a battle over science religion, and I don't really think Black America is either. I don't know about Hispanic Americans, but yeah, this is a white American problem, okay? And it's like a peculiarity of our, culture. And, you know, I think one of the issues is, you know, I said that the Protestant Reformation happened around the same time that science was happening, is that a lot of theologians were like, well, we have to find a one correct answer and everybody has to agree on the same answer. And they tried to impose these things that were like really, really successful in science, and they tried to impose them on religion. And so it's changed the way that we view religion as this thing where everything's very precise and well-defined and we have to agree. And you know, one of the things I think is particularly strange about this viewpoint is this idea that we're like saved by theology, that like it seems as if a lot of Christians think we're going to get up to the gates of heaven and then they're going to say, okay, what was your opinion on infant baptism? Okay, check. And then like they'll decide whether to let us in. Like this is not at all a Jewish view of religion, because they think that you'll be judged on your actions. Like God doesn't care what you believe, he cares what you do. And so we spend a lot of time arguing over these esoteric things like free will. And you know, I love this stuff. I don't mind a good esoteric debate over free will, but it also depends more on what we do, right? So I'm going to show you another graph of brain sizes, but these are in different types of primates today. And then, so like this is the brain size here, and let's like not even, this is like a relative scale or whatever, so let's not even go there. But then this graph is showing the female group size, and this graph is showing the male group size. And so, you know, when you look at the places where there's data, like there's no data on a primate with a large male group size and a small female group size because none of them exist, right? And you know, one of the things that we needed to do to make big brains is like, it means we have to be pregnant for longer, and it means our infants are more helpless. And so women need to help each other take care of infants. And so female group size and like bonding among women especially was crucial. We would not be humans if it were not for that. Now, like, you know, when anthropologists first started doing their thing a couple hundred years ago, they sort of like imagined that the, like the Fred Flintstone type of primitive man, you know, like it's a nuclear family and the dad goes out to eat and then the mom stays home with the kids. But this was not what it was. These were bands primarily organized around a group of women who did infant care for each other, usually related, and then, you know, men joined as they were desired, right? And then what we see happen is that as they get smarter and smarter, the men get better and better at bossing around, and then they start to pull towards a larger male group size. But then you'll also notice that the brain size goes down with this. So really, because our brains grew because of social activity and because we learned how to do social activity, and women are the ones who drove that because that's what they need to raise infants, that like female solidarity was what made our brains human for a long time. So, you know, when we look back in the past, there is a real thing that happened that we can find in the anthropological and historical record that corresponds to the same time period that they were writing about in Genesis, so the 6,000 to 7,000 year ago time period. And this is that before that time period, we were all hunter-gatherers. And then we shifted over to, you know, most places went through a pastoral period. And that's, you know, where we're kind of in between. We still move around and we still forage for food, but we're also like taking cattle to graze or sheep to graze in different places. And then, you know, about 6,000 years ago, in the Levant at least, they switched over to an agricultural way of life. And, you know, these years are kind of all, like everybody was hunter-gatherers 12,000 years ago. And almost everybody was agricultural less than 6,000 years ago. But this transition happened at different times and in different ways in different places. But it's sort of, because it did happen very universally almost everywhere on the globe, it seems to have gone along with us growing in brain size, right? So not only do we get smarter and we can figure out how to do things more, But actually, like, one of the things that we really did develop in our brains as we got smarter was a fear of death. Like, animals aren't afraid of death unless there's a bear. Like, if there's no scary thing there, they're not thinking about death, and they're not afraid of death. So, one of the things that is in the Garden of Eden story is that, God tells the people that, like, when you eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge, then you will die. And the way I interpret that is not that before that nobody died. Before that, people did die. It's just that nobody cared. And if you think about it, and you don't have to say, like, as I've matured in my religious view over my lifetime, that when I was younger, I worried more about heaven. And as I've gotten older, I just don't think about heaven that much at all. Because you look around you and you see the cycles of life, you see new people being born, and, like, I'm less worried about the exact me existing as long as there's humanity that continues to exist. Now, I still believe in heaven, and I still think I'm going to heaven, but it's not something I'm all anxious and hung up on. And, like, one of the objections you often hear to evolution is that, oh, it's like, how could God build humanity out of this endless cycle of death? But an endless cycle of death is only really worrying at the moment that you're dying. Most of the time, it's fine. And especially if you don't remember it afterwards, it's not such a big deal either. So, one of the reasons that we switch over from hunter-gatherer is because we get smarter and we learn how to do things like farm. But another reason is because we can store up food so that when there's a bad year, we don't all die. So it was also like fear of death that drove this transition. And like the basic features of hunter-gatherer are that they're nomadic and they move around over the time of the year to look for the place where there's the best plants and animals to use. And this means they take up a lot of space. So hunter-gatherers take up way more space to, like, support one person than farmers do. And, like, they're also most egalitarian because, like, when I say that it's female group size that helped us grow brains, I don't mean to say that the men were unimportant or anything. Like, there was still conflict between tribes, and there was just still a need for hunting, and men had a very important role. It's not that they didn't have a very important role, but because the center of the group was female, those groups kicked out, basically alpha guys who were mean to everybody. Like, so only 95% of the men got to come in, right? And, I say that's a thing that we maybe aren't the best at these days. Albert and I have talked about it, that narcissists who are abusive make it to positions of power. And it's usually because they're smart and they're good at making people like them. And they don't stay in one group of people long enough for those people to say, wait a second, I don't think this guy is very nice. And so, that's why churches are important even today, because these are groups that are tribal sized. They're groups of 50 to 200 people where we can get to know everybody, and we trust people because we know them and we have experience of them. A lot of what society is like a substitution for trust. So, like, if, money is very much like this. Like, we all trust money because we trust the US government. I don't have to trust you when you give me $1. I just say it looks like $1. I don't have to know you. We can make a deal and we can exchange things even though we don't know each other. So, like, there's these mechanisms that allow us to grow that stand in for our instincts around social behavior. And, like, when we have social problems, it's because our culture isn't always well adapted to, like, the bigger groups that we have. And things that, we were able to kick out people who were not working or eating more than they should, taking more resources than they should, better when we had smaller groups. And so really what happens at the start of this transition is inequality. And part of that reason is, like I just said, we kicked out the people who were abusing the system. But also, like, there wasn't really much wealth in this, most of your like wealth, like the stuff you had that, you know, enabled you to survive was your body back in this time. So like, you know, people that had good bodies that were strong or whatever, like they had more wealth than other people, but that's not something you can transfer. Like you just get what you get, right? The very first wealth was cattle and goats and stuff like this. And this is something that, like, you know, you can feed them in the good years and then you can kill them in the bad years, or if there's a long winter or something like this. So this wealth is not like a bad thing. It helps us survive, and that's why we started saving it up. But then we also see a rise in inequality, and that inequality is able to be bigger. Like when our wealth is just like our bodies, then we sort of get what we get. When people start to use animals as wealth, then they can have bigger, you know, some people can have more animals than others. And then when we move to agriculture, we start to have, you know, not just food itself, and this grain was especially important to us, not because it's like easy to grow grain or easy to eat grain, but because we could store it for a long time. And so, and you know, these stories are in the Bible, right? Like, you know, they get through periods of famine because they have grain stored up. But that also allows there to be more inequality in the society and for some people to take more advantage of others. So like as we move from these hunter-gatherers, they go from more egalitarian to more unequal. And then another interesting thing we see is that hunter-gatherers actually had it pretty good in that they only, you know, if we go look at the few hunter-gatherer tribes that exist today, they tend to work 15 to 25 hours a week. They have it pretty sweet. As soon as they switch over to agriculture, they're working, you know, 70 hours a week or something like that to get by. It's a more difficult way of life, and they also become shorter and less healthy because their diet is more like, you know, grain. It doesn't have like all the vitamins that you would have if you were foraging out in the field. When we were hunter-gatherers, we had more nutritional diversity and we were healthier as a result. And so, you know, these people weren't as healthy. So, to me, the second story in Genesis just makes a huge, huge, huge amount of sense as a story of this transition. Like all of the major points of this story are in the Genesis story. So, like, we see it go from a more egalitarian society where they're you know, women tend to live with their mothers, and so that's called matrilineal. It's not matriarchal. Matriarchal means women are in charge. Matrilineal means women stay living near their parents, right? And then it's a shift to patrilineal because now it's the men who own the cows and they have the wealth and they kind of get to say things at the time. And you find this in the Garden of Eve story. Like, at the beginning, they're treated very equally, but then, you know, there's talk about man ruling over women. And then the curse that man gets, that he shall, you know, toil by the sweat of his brow for all his days. Like here we have this going from working 15 to 25 hours a week to working your butt off and still having trouble getting enough food to eat. And then, like, also what you see is a change in violence as we go along this, because here there's not much to fight over. Like if we look in the record at people who died of violence, like there were still people who died of violence, but there wasn't large-scale warfare. It was mostly like interpersonal tiffs and things like this, and maybe a tribe might fight another tribe over territory, but probably only if there was like a famine going on or something like that. And there's no reason for them to have big old wars like that because there's nothing to fight over. Like nobody has any wealth, and so there's not much to fight over. And also, like, another thing that you see these men fighting over is women. And in this, it's women who say, well, I will let you live with my family or not. And so there's not fighting over women too. So when you go to pastoral, you see the very first warfare, and then as society grows in size, you see that warfare become bigger and bigger as, like, you know, one country builds up wealth and then the other one attacks it to take that wealth. And you see this emerge in the story, not just because, like, the early part of the Genesis tells stories about wars, but it's also inherent in the fabric of the story itself, because Cain is a farmer, and Cain kills Abel, who's a pastoral person. And then to go even further back is Eve picking from the garden, from the tree, and eating the fruit. And that's because in the Levant, in the Middle East, fruit was the first cultivated plant. So like in other areas, grains are the first cultivated plants. But they have found evidence of olive trees being cultivated in the area around Israel about 6,000 to 7,000 years ago. Again, right at the time where there's this transition from farmer to agriculture. And you know, like, it's hard to cultivate fruit if not a lot of fruit grows around, but if you're in an area where fruit does grow, then it's like you eat the fruit when it's in season, and then you notice that the pits you leave behind might grow into new trees the next year, and you do some pruning every time you come back to that spot. And that is sort of, has thought, how people got the very first idea for agriculture. So like in this story of the creation of humans, we see something very real that happened, which is this major transition in society. And like what I say is like, we need to eat. And today we're kind of often shielded from the inevitability and power of that, because we're all lucky to live in a world where we probably mostly didn't go hungry. But because it's an inexorable human need, human life and civilization has always shaped itself around the way that we eat. So like that's our economy. Like, how do we work? Like today it's how we make money, but that came out of how do we make food? And because that has changed, whenever that changes, you necessarily see a change in the culture itself, in the ways that people live. And the religion changes along with it, the morality changes along with it, because, morality isn't, some people like to imagine morality is just like God told us it should be so every day, but like practically speaking, morality is doing what allows our neighbor to live in addition to how we live. And so when we live in different ways, our morals change. Like everything about that world changes. So let's take a little 5-minute break, and then when we come back, we're going to do a little discussion with men and women on different, so maybe the men could sit over here. So I believe I mentioned last week that I think that our world is in the midst of another transition like this. So at the end of the 1800s, even in America, 80% of people were still farming. And so we were still living in this. And now we talk about both the Industrial Revolution as changing most of us over to heavy industry, and now we're in the midst of the information revolution and stuff like this. But on this sort of time scale, those sort of blend into one. And we also find that America and Europe are at the forefront of that, just like when some people were the first to make the leap to farming, and then other countries are in other parts of that. But it's just as inexorable. So some of us can't sit down and say, well, no, we don't want to be information age, actually. Just like people couldn't sit down here and say, well, actually, we want to be farmers. And I can give an excellent example of some people who wanted to still live a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, but were prevented, and that is indigenous Americans. So they were still working in this hunter-gatherer thing where nobody owns land. People, different tribes are sharing land and using it for different purposes. But once some people come in that believe in land ownership, then if you don't also believe in land ownership, you're going to end up with no land. And we have something similar happening today. We can't just say, oh, no, I don't want to live in the information age. I don't want the, economy that brings along with it, so I'm just not going to do it. We're forced into that by the fact that other people around us choose. And like the way this first happened in the industrial age is that when you first start taking technological innovations, the very first thing they apply them to is farming. And so the people who use those technological innovations are able to produce much more food, much faster and much cheaper. And then they sell that food for cheaper than the farmers who are not using the technology. And so that pushes the farmer out of business. And this similar things are happening now. All over the world. So like this change is inevitable. We can't just say, oh, I want to keep our lives back here, and we also can't say I want to keep like all our religious habits exactly the same either. The world is changing whether we want it or not. And in my opinion, the reason why we have Christianity on the right now is because we need to adapt to the new world. And I need you guys and us to talk about that now as older generations that still have some wisdom and some connection with this previous way of life. We can't just say, oh, well, the young people will figure it out, because probably they won't, and Christianity will just die. So like we need to have conversations now where we ask questions about the Bible and Scripture with a little bit more mystery, and like saying, I don't know for sure, and let's try out some different things. But do that as older people who have more wisdom, and try to find things that we can leave on for the future world. This week and the next week, we're going to consider this text from Genesis 2:7 to Genesis 4:1. Which you can sort of bookend by, this is the first man, where, the Lord God formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And the man became a living being, to the second man. Now the man knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have gotten a man with the Lord. So we're going to use this text, and I will invite you as homework, this time I'm giving you homework, to read that text and try and come up with a couple of things that you didn't notice about the text before, if you can, and then let's share them next time. But what I'm going to do is point out a couple of things that I noticed in the text, and then I'm going to do theology with that and ask you to participate with me, and we'll see what we can come up with. So this part I've written out in sermon form. In the biblical account of the Garden of Eve, Adam actually names his human companion twice. The first time he names her woman, for she was taken out of man. The second time he names her Eve, because she was the mother of all living. So what did Eve do that earned her this honor of a new name, a name that marks her not simply as an appendage of man, but describes her essence as a separate individual with a different task? Was it because she had produced children? The biblical text tells us that woman becomes Eve before her first named child is born, Cain. The text also very explicitly describes the conception of Cain as a separate event that occurs after Eve has received her new name. It could be that Eve had other children before the fall, but these are not named by the text. So I ask again, why does Adam give her a new name? The second naming of Eve occurs right in the middle of the part of the story we commonly call the curse. First, God speaks to the serpent, then the woman, then Adam, explaining what will happen to each. Then Adam gives his wife her new name. Finally, God makes clothes for the man and his wife and drives the man out of the Garden of Eden. So it occurs right after the fall, right after God has spoken pronouncements to and Adam is given his pronouncement last. So Adam gets his curse, and then he gives Eve this new name, mother of all. Now, traditionally, there's this original sin theology that hinges on this biblical account of the fall. And Augustine of Hippo, a 4th century theologian who I like to call the original sin originator, explicitly compared the first woman's offering of fruit to the first man to the ongoing sexual temptation of all men by women. Within this paradigm, at the moment Eve is named mother of all living by Adam, God has just given man rightful dominion over woman because her sin was worse than his. Not only did she eat the fruit first, but she then tempted man to eat. So, more sin, right? Historically, this theology has been used to justify the ensuing millennia of patriarchy as a necessary correction for woman's inherently more irresponsible nature. So, if Adam chooses this moment, the moment directly after he supposedly has been given dominion over his irresponsible wife, to name her individual essence, why does he give her a name of such respect as mother of all, despite the fact that the story so far reports her as mother of none? Why does he not name her temptress, sinner, Jezebel? This question is one of the many blocks that can be pulled from the Jenga tower of the traditional interpretation, and in your reading this week, I invite you to look for any others. And I say that we need not dismiss the Bible as a bunch of old desert myths to reject the theology of original sin, along with its misogynist justification of the long historical record of dismissive and cruel treatment for women and children. But I've done this close reading only as an adult. I first learned a different interpretation of the story of the Garden of Eden at my daddy's knee, one in which he always told me Eve was the genius who figured it out. Now, what was this it? That's what I'll be talking about this week. But what I'm saying here is I grew up in a religion with a different interpretation of this story, and so when I became a Methodist, it was one of the things that I examined, and that's why I first looked at this story in more depth. Now, I'm asking you to do the same, because we don't always think of these things. It doesn't occur to us to try and do a different reading of the scripture than the traditional one and try to look, now wait, does the actual text match with the picture of this I have in my head? So the topic I'd like us to end with today is reproductive theology, the theology of the unborn child. What I want us to take from the story of the Garden of Eden is two things. The first is that man named woman is something special and worthy of respect before she ever had a child. I ask my fellow women to claim this for yourselves. We and you are mothers of life. We have a special respect in that position along with the special responsibility that always comes with a position of respect. We own that responsibility before we have a child, and even if we never have a child. Now, this is a very important distinction for me because I'm infertile. I had my first miscarriage at 22 and my last at 38. I always wanted to have children very much, and that is, was part of guiding my life since I was a young adult. I've rarely had the opportunity to publicly talk about this because, the world's definition of mother is that you're not a mother until you've birthed your child. And so we don't always have the space to talk about our experiences with wanting a child and preparing for a child and losing a child. And these are things that also matter to coming up with a theology for the unborn. So that's part of the reason why I'm going to ask us to have some separate discussion, because men and women have different experiences, right? I say to my fellow women, whether you have children or not, and whether you want your own children, we women are mothers. At every point in our life, whether we are partnered or not, whether we have birthed life children or not, I believe God's call to us is to make the world a safe and healthy place for all children to flourish. A child cannot be safe and healthy if their mother is not safe and healthy. Thus, the first person we're called to mother is ourselves. I believe this includes taking care of ourselves in that special motherly way over our entire lives, during every time period and over every facet of our existence. We must care for ourselves at times in our life when we are actually caring for children, but also before and after those times. We must care for our home and family life and also care for our work, our health, and our relationships, because there's no separation between us actually mothering and all of the other parts of our life. Similarly, a child cannot be safe and healthy if their society is not safe and healthy. For millennia, some men have used women's special role as mothers to argue against their role in public life, be it work, church, or politics. Personally, I do not ascribe to the extremist modern view that men and women are exactly the same and any apparent difference between us can be chalked entirely up to culture and patriarchy. Women truly are, on average, different from men in some ways at a biological level because of our different reproductive roles. And this has built who we are as humans for the last 300,000 years, and it's still a part of us today. But for me, this is an argument for the full participation of women in the work of building and sustaining society. Motherly instincts are needed to help build a society that is safe and healthy for children. The second thing I want us to take from the story of the Garden of Eden is that we often do not recognize this unique importance of woman. When God first made Eve, Adam did not recognize her for what she was. He saw the woman merely as an extension of himself. It was only after being chastened by God that he recognized her unique power and glory. But after this, God hides his face from humanity. God no longer appears to chasten man every time he makes the same mistake. Women, we ourselves do not always recognize our own importance. When God speaks to the woman, what he tells her is, I will multiply your pain in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children, yet your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. Grammatically speaking, man's rule over woman is not a full sentence, but a clause. Furthermore, it's not spoken to the man, but the woman. It's certainly not a command or permission given to men. Personally, I read it as a warning. Women desire men, and so we let them rule us. But when we let men rule, we ourselves forget our own distinct role as mothers, which should be expressed at the societal level. As far as we know, men wrote every single word of the Bible, and up until quite recently, men have also dominated theology. This is not to say that women have had no influence. Women have always been part of the greater Christian society that theologians have spoken to, and that broad Christian society has always had some choice about how to respond to the different theologies that were presented to them by theologians. Particularly since the Protestant Reformation, Christian society has expressed that voice simply by choosing which denomination to join. So we have broad power to choose, but we don't have specific power. It is the theologians who've set the bounds of theological conversation. Thus, men have so far largely determined which topics are theologically important, and of course their personal experience and interest has guided these choices. There are many topics for which men and women have similar interests. But at this time in history, we women should be asking what theological topics might have been neglected up until now. In asking this, we're not necessarily looking to find topics that have never before been mentioned. Instead, we're looking for topics that have not been studied with the same depth and care that they might have been if it were primarily women who were setting the agenda. I find it notable that no Christian denomination on earth has ever had an official doctrine for the unborn. Some Catholic theologians have proposed that unborn or unbaptized newborn babies go to an afterlife called limbo. Since they never lived, they can never be judged as either good or bad. Thus, they remain stuck in this place of in-between forever, never given a chance to live and never able to rejoin their families. But this idea is not based on any particular scripture and has never been adopted as official doctrine. The Bible has nothing definitive to say about the souls of their unborn. There are certainly verses about the unborn that we hear from time to time. One of the most commonly used is Psalm 139, "For you created my inmost being, you knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful." When used as a proof text, which means taken out of the context of the rest of the scripture around it and selected by the speaker out of many verses that referenced the unborn to stand by itself, this verse may seem clear. The unborn are seen and valued by God. But that still doesn't end. That's not a theology of the unborn. I would like us today to, separate into our groups and talk both about our personal experience with parenthood and just what do we think the theology of the unborn is. Now, there are scriptures that are relevant, and I have a whole bunch more written here I could talk about, but none of them say this is what happens. And in my opinion, where the Bible is silent, especially when it comes to women, because women did not choose the topics of the Bible, our experience is relevant. And so I invite us to take this time to just talk about what our experience has been, what it feels like to be a parent. So,
How much time is that?
we have about 15 minutes.
And then do you want to reconvene the larger group, or?
Yeah, I don't think we need to reconvene today. So I'll just see you guys. I'll see you guys next week, and I'll come talk to you guys now.